Thank you very much, Pippa. That was excellent. So I'll just show you some brief data. So we've talked about the issue, and what I wanted to talk about is the numbers a little bit. And we can see, just looking in the Web of Science, that around 30 years ago, in 1980, so more than 30 years ago, nearly 40 years ago, you could see that there was different proportions of research published by people based in different regions of the world. And over the last 4 decades, that has developed. You can see these lines at the bottom here that represent people in the regions of, that top one there is the ASEAN, sorry, it's not, it's the Middle East countries. The next one is the Latin America countries. And then there are the African totals. So if you look at those, you can see, in fact, that in the last 10 years, they have increased very steeply from their base. The quickest growing region of all is this light blue line, which is Asia-Pacific. And that's had 2 inflections, one in the early 90s and one about 10 years later. And this has chiefly been driven, but not entirely, by China, which has now overtaken in output all of the other regions. Here you've got the European Union, 28 countries, and just underneath you've got the European 15 countries. You know that in Europe we have been growing the number of countries in the Union, but you can see that the original ones are what we would call Western Europe, and then the additional ones are more from Eastern Europe and Central Europe. And if you just look back 10 years, there was almost no difference between the output of the two, meaning that the increase, this difference is responsible for the increase in output from the Eastern and Central European countries. And the United States is here, also has increased, but not as quickly as some of the other regions. In fact, I can show you that if you look at the blue bar, 1980, the United States was responsible for 36% of the authors in the Web of Science. That's now gone down to 25%. So it's actually not true when people say the Web of Science is an America-focused database. In fact, 3 in every 4 papers don't feature an American author at all. In India, the proportion of Indian authors has more than doubled, and in China, it was negligible 40 years ago, and it now counts for 15% of the articles published. And bear in mind that in the Web of Science, we are talking about journals that are considered international, high impact, and representative of a network of scholars in any given field. So these are what we would call the highest quality or the most elite journals. And this doesn't represent all of the other journals in the world where we can't see that the increase, which must be enormous. There are many more journals in the world that are not indexed anywhere. And this represents a lot of challenges and barriers to people who are trying to publish in what is termed an international journal. People are always told in countries around the world that they need to publish internationally. But there's very often no definition of what that means. An international journal is often considered to be a journal that is indexed in either the Web of Science or in Scopus. Sometimes it's for the reason of the university ranking systems. Some of those use Scopus and some use Web of Science. Others want to see that the journal has an impact factor, which means it must be in Web of Science. So there's a huge drive for people to publish in those journals, but there is a kind of limited number of journals that are indexed. So with the massive rise in output, they've now had to turn to local or regional journals. So there is an insufficient number of international journals, and therefore we have a rise in journals from universities around the world who naturally assume that if they do it right, their journal will then be added to the indexes, which presents a problem for people like Marianne, because they have to make decisions and choose and say, We have our criteria, and we can't accept every single journal in the world. So I spend a lot of my time talking to editors and small publishers and researchers in emerging countries, and try to give them advice on also try to manage their expectations. If it's a journal which is very institutional and nobody reads it outside that institution, I try to explain this is not going to make it into an international citation database, and therefore temper their expectations. Also, there's a tendency of people to name their journal, rename it the International Journal of, which of course is an exaggeration, and I've told them a million times not to exaggerate. Because first of all, what the evaluators do is they look at the editorial board and they look at the author affiliations, and they will see whether it's really an international journal or regional or national or even an institutional journal. So these exaggerated claims are going to disqualify the application. And the other thing to look at is the claiming of being indexed in things which aren't actually indexes. That's something else that comes up a lot. So we do ask people to try to get that claim right. And there are many, many other mistakes people make, and they talk about other impact factors which have strange names. However, I would say most of what we're talking about is how the emerging regions need to change in order to fit in with the traditional publishing world, whereas the title of this talk is actually the opposite. How does the traditional publishing world have to change to cater for that increased output? So I would say perhaps with a little flexibility. I don't mean lowering the standards, but I do mean being a little more flexible with the claims that these journals are making, or publishers. When they talk about things, we shouldn't automatically disqualify them and consider them a little bit more in terms of what they are providing and what they might bring to the big databases. Anyway, in the interest of time, I'm going to give way and bring up Marianne, the next speaker, and invite you to listen to what she has to say. Thank you.